The creaking of wooden boards and the gentle lapping of waves against a ship's hull might evoke images of adventure and exploration. But for some unfortunate souls in maritime history, these sounds were the prelude to a horrifying ordeal. Keelhauling, a punishment so severe it could make even the most hardened sailors quake in their boots, stands as a testament to the brutal justice meted out on the high seas. As the famous 18th century English writer Samuel Johnson once remarked, being in a ship is being in a jail with the chance of being drowned, a sentiment that took on a far more sinister meaning for those facing this dreaded punishment. This practice, which originated in the Dutch Navy during the 17th century, involved dragging a sailor underneath the ship's keel from one side to the other. The term itself comes from the Dutch word Keelhauling, meaning to haul under the keel. While often associated with piracy, keelhauling was primarily used by naval forces as a form of disciplinary action against their own crew members. The Dutch, known for their naval prowess during the golden age of the 17th century, were particularly infamous for employing this brutal method of maintaining discipline aboard their ships. One of the earliest recorded instances of keelhauling dates back to 1622, when a Dutch sailor named Pilgrim Willemst was sentenced to this punishment for striking his captain. The incident occurred aboard the ship Hollandia while it was anchored off the coast of present-day Jakarta, Indonesia. Willemst survived the ordeal, but his fate served as a chilling warning to other sailors contemplating insubordination. The Dutch Articles of War, published in 1629 by Stadholder Frederick Henry, Prince of Orange, officially codified keelhauling as a punishment for severe infractions such as mutiny, theft, or sodomy. These articles remained in effect for over 2 centuries, shaping the harsh disciplinary culture of the Dutch Navy. The process of keelhauling was as meticulous as it was merciless. The condemned would be stripped naked and tied with ropes, often with weights attached to ensure they sank deep enough to pass under the ship. Crew members would then haul the unfortunate soul from one side of the vessel to the other, dragging them beneath the barnacle-encrusted hull. In some cases, a wooden board or mattress was sometimes tied to the victim's back in a token effort to provide some protection, though this often proved futile against the razor-sharp barnacles and the crushing pressure of the water. For those subjected to this torment, the experience was nothing short of nightmarish. Captain Charles Johnson, in his 1724 book, A General History of the Pirates, vividly described the ordeal. The delinquent shall be stripped stark naked, and a rope tied about his middle, with which he shall be hoisted up to the end of the yardarm, from whence he shall be violently let fall into the sea and drawn underneath the ship's keel. Johnson's account, while sensationalized in parts, provides a rare contemporary description of the punishment and has significantly influenced our modern understanding of maritime punishments during the golden age of piracy. The chances of survival were slim. If the victim didn't drown, they faced the risk of being shredded by the sharp barnacles and other marine growth on the ship's hull. Those who did survive often emerged with severe lacerations, broken bones, and internal injuries. Many succumbed to their wounds or subsequent infections in the days following the punishment. In fact, naval records from the Dutch East India Company suggest that the mortality rate for keelhauling could be as high as 50%, making it one of the most feared punishments at sea. One particularly harrowing account comes from the journal of John Tionge, a naval chaplain who witnessed a keelhauling aboard the HMS Assistance in 1676. He wrote, "In a moment, he was drawn from one side of the ship under the keel to the other, by which he was so grated all over his body that it was almost impossible for him to recover it." Tionge's eyewitness account provides a rare glimpse into the reality of this punishment, far removed from the romanticized depictions in later literature and film. While the Dutch Navy was notorious for its use of keelhauling, other European navies also employed this brutal punishment. The Russian Navy, under Tsar Peter the Great, adopted the practice in the early 18th century as part of its efforts to modernize along Western lines. In 1705, Peter himself witnessed the keel-hauling of several sailors accused of theft aboard the ship Munka in the port of Voronezh. The Tsar reportedly remarked that it was an excellent means to maintain discipline. This imperial endorsement ensured that keel-hauling remained a part of Russian naval discipline well into the 19th century. Surprisingly, keel-hauling was never officially sanctioned by the British Royal Navy, although unofficial instances were reported. Admiral John Byng, writing in his memoirs in the mid-18th century, mentioned witnessing a keel-hauling aboard a British ship, though he condemned the practice as barbarous and un-English. The French Navy, too, largely abstained from the practice, considering it too barbaric even by the standards of the time. The famous French naval officer and explorer Louis-Antoine de Bougainville wrote in his journal in 1766, "Such cruelty is unworthy of a civilized nation and serves only to harden the hearts of men." As for pirates, contrary to popular belief, keel-hauling was not a common punishment among them. Pirates typically favored quicker and less elaborate forms of discipline or execution, such as marooning or walking the plank. However, the threat of keel-hauling was often used to instill fear and maintain order aboard pirate vessels. The infamous Pirate Code of Bartholomew Roberts, established in 1721, made no mention of keel-hauling, instead focusing on more practical forms of punishment, like flogging or marooning. One infamous pirate who allegedly employed keel-hauling was Edward Lowe, active in the 1720s. Known for his sadistic tendencies, Lowe was said to have keel-hauled captives from merchant ships he plundered. One account tells of Lowe keel-hauling the captain of a captured vessel off the coast of Newfoundland in 1723, allegedly for refusing to divulge the location of hidden valuables. However, these accounts are largely based on sensationalized stories and may be more legend than fact, as much of Lowe's reputation comes from second-hand accounts and popular lore. The brutality of keel-hauling did not go unnoticed by contemporary critics. In 1749, the French philosopher Montesquieu condemned the practice in his work The Spirit of the Laws, writing, "Keel-hauling ought to be prescribed in all nations, because it is contrary to humanity." Montesquieu's criticism reflected a growing sentiment among Enlightenment thinkers that such extreme forms of punishment were incompatible with the ideals of a civilized society. Despite its reputation for cruelty, keel-hauling persisted in some navies well into the 19th century. The last officially recorded instance of keel-hauling in the Dutch Navy occurred in 1853 aboard the frigate USS Friso. The victim, a sailor named Johannes Franken, survived the ordeal but suffered severe injuries. This incident sparked public outrage in the Netherlands and contributed to the eventual abolition of the practice. In Russia, keel-hauling was officially abolished in 1864 as part of broader naval reforms under Tsar Alexander II. Clashes of the Sea, the brutal symphony of the cat-o'-nine-tails. The sharp whistle of leather cutting through air, followed by the sickening thud of impact on bare flesh, echoed across the wooden decks of ships for centuries. This was the sound of the cat-o'-nine-tails, a fearsome instrument of punishment that struck terror into the hearts of sailors and pirates alike. The practice of flogging, particularly with this multi-tailed whip, was a brutal reality of life at sea, leaving both physical and psychological scars on those unfortunate enough to feel its bite. As the renowned naval historian N.M. Roger once wrote, "The cat-o'-nine-tails was the voice of naval discipline, speaking a language every seaman understood." The cat-o'-nine-tails, often simply called the cat, was a whip consisting of 9 knotted cords attached to a sturdy handle. Each cord was typically about 2 feet long, made of thin rope or rawhide, and sometimes adorned with metal shards or glass to increase its devastating effect. The origin of its name is shrouded in maritime lore, with some suggesting it stems from the 9 lives of a cat, while others attribute it to the scratch-like wounds it left on the victim's back. Interestingly, the term cat-o'-nine-tails first appeared in print in 1681 in Thomas Otway's play The Soldier's Fortune, though the instrument itself had been in use long before. Flogging as a form of naval discipline dates back to ancient times, but it reached its zenith during the Age of Sail, from the 16th to the 19th centuries. In the British Royal Navy, flogging was officially sanctioned in 1661 when the Articles of War were established. These articles, which governed naval discipline, allowed captains to order floggings for a wide range of offences, from minor infractions like drunkenness to more serious crimes such as theft or mutiny. The infamous Captain William Kidd, before turning to piracy, served as a privateer and was known to use the cat liberally. In 1695, while commanding the Adventure Galley, he flogged a crew member for insubordination, an event that foreshadowed his later reputation for cruelty. One of the most notorious incidents of flogging occurred in 1797 aboard the HMS Hermione. Captain Hugh Piggott, known for his sadistic tendencies, ordered the flogging of several sailors for not furling the sails quickly enough during a storm. The brutality of his punishment, which included flogging a man to death, led to a bloody mutiny. The crew, driven to desperation, killed Piggott and several of his officers, throwing their bodies overboard. This event shocked the British Admiralty and led to discussions about reforming the practice of flogging. Admiral Lord St. Vincent, upon hearing of the mutiny, remarked, "I fear the cat o' nine tails has much to answer for in this dreadful business." The number of lashes administered varied widely depending on the offence and the whim of the captain. Minor infractions might result in a dozen lashes, while more severe punishments could reach hundreds. In 1812, aboard the USS Chesapeake, Commodore James Barron ordered 500 lashes to be administered to a sailor named Robert Jeffrey for stealing cheese. Jeffrey survived this horrific ordeal, but many were not so fortunate. Infections from the wounds were common, and death from blood loss or shock was not unheard of. In 1731, a British sailor named John Barrell received 500 lashes for desertion. He survived the initial flogging but died 3 days later from his wounds, prompting one officer to note in his log, "The cat has claimed another of its 9 lives." Pirates, despite their reputation for lawlessness, also employed flogging as a means of maintaining discipline. The infamous pirate Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, included flogging in his ship's articles. His code stated that any man who shall strike another, whilst these articles are in force, shall receive Moses's law, that is, 40 stripes lacking one, on the bare back. This biblical reference to 39 lashes was a common measurement for punishment, believed to be the maximum a man could endure without dying. Edward Lowe, another notorious pirate operating in the 1720s, was known for his creative use of the cat. He once flogged a captured captain with a cat soaked in pickle brine, adding an extra layer of agony to the punishment. The psychological impact of flogging was as severe as its physical toll. Admiral John Jarvis, Earl of St. Vincent, once remarked, "Discipline is preserved in a ship by the dread of punishment." This dread was palpable among the crew whenever a flogging was to be administered. All hands were called to witness the punishment, a practice known as watching the cat. The victim was typically tied to a grating or a mast, his back bared to receive the lashes. The ship's surgeon would stand by, ostensibly to determine if the punishment should be halted, but often this was a mere formality. Samuel Leach, a sailor who served in both the British and American navies, wrote in his memoirs, "The day of punishment was always a day of terror in the ship. The air of death-like stillness that reigned throughout the ship as the crew gathered to witness the scene was painfully oppressive." One sailor, Jack Nastyface, described the aftermath of a flogging in his memoirs. When cut down, he was taken to the sick bay, where the doctor dressed his wounds with pickle. Many days elapsed before he was able to perform his duty, and several weeks before his shirt could be endured to touch his back. The use of brine to clean the wounds was standard practice, adding another layer of agony to the already excruciating experience. In 1811, a young midshipman named Frederick Marryat witnessed a particularly severe flogging aboard HMS Imperieuse. He later became a novelist and used his experiences to vividly describe floggings in his books, helping to turn public opinion against the practice. Not all captains were enthusiastic about flogging. Captain William Bligh, despite his reputation following the mutiny on the Bounty, was known to use flogging sparingly. In his logbook from 1787, he wrote, "I punished John Bowman seaman with 12 lashes for disobedience and contempt." This man had lately been punished for similar offences. Bligh's relative restraint in administering punishment was notable for the time. Similarly, Captain James Cook, during his voyages of exploration in the 1770s, used flogging as a last resort. He preferred to employ alternative punishments, such as confinement or reduced rations, believing that excessive flogging demoralized the crew. The practice of flogging began to decline in the 19th century as public opinion turned against it. Charles Dickens, in his novel David Copperfield, described a flogging as a wretched spectacle helping to sway public sentiment. In 1850, the United States Congress limited the number of lashes that could be administered to 12, and in 1862, flogging was officially abolished in the US Navy. The British Royal Navy followed suit in 1879, although it retained flogging as a punishment for mutiny until 1881. Herman Melville, who served in the US Navy and later wrote Moby Dick, was a vocal critic of flogging. In his novel White Jacket he wrote, "However childish, ignorant and inexperienced a man may be, yet he claims respect in virtue of his manhood. But he is lashed like a dog." Cast away, the grim fate of marooned pirates. The gentle lapping of waves against pristine shores might sound idyllic, but for pirates of old, these same sounds could be a death knell. Marooning, a punishment as feared as it was infamous, lurked in the shadows of every pirate's mind. This practice, which involved abandoning a person on a desolate island or coast with little to no provisions, was not just a plot device in fantastical tales, but a very real and terrifying consequence for those who dared to cross their fellow buccaneers. As the legendary pirate captain Bartholomew Roberts once declared, "A merry life and a short one shall be my motto," a sentiment that took on a dark irony for those left to waste away on forgotten shores. The origins of marooning can be traced back to the early days of maritime exploration. The term itself is believed to derive from the Spanish word cimarron, which referred to runaway cattle or slaves in the Caribbean. By the 17th century, it had evolved to describe the act of abandoning someone in a remote, uninhabited area. Interestingly, the practice wasn't limited to the New World. Records show that as early as 1509, the Portuguese explorer Francisco de Almeida marooned mutineers on a remote island in the Indian Ocean, demonstrating the global reach of this cruel punishment. One of the earliest recorded instances of marooning occurred in 1502, when Christopher Columbus, during his fourth voyage to the New World, marooned his mutinous crew member Francisco de Porras on the island of Jamaica. This act set a precedent that would be followed by both navies and pirates for centuries to come. Columbus himself wrote in his journal, "Let them stay and live here, for this is the paradise they have chosen," a chilling dismissal of those he left behind. Pirates, however, elevated marooning to an art form, enshrining it in their codes and using it as a tool to maintain order within their ranks. The infamous pirate Bartholomew Roberts, also known as Black Bart, included marooning in his Articles of Agreement, which stated, "If any man shall offer to run away, or keep any secret from the company, he shall be marooned with 1 bottle of powder, 1 bottle of water, 1 small arm, and shot." Roberts, who terrorized the seas from 1719 to 1722, was known for his strict adherence to this code, reportedly marooning several crew members during his career, including a carpenter named James Skirmer, who had the audacity to challenge Roberts's authority. The items granted to the marooned individual were more a cruel joke than a lifeline. A single pistol with 1 shot was often provided, not for hunting or self-defense, but as a means for the condemned to end their own suffering quickly, rather than face a slow death from starvation or exposure. This grim provision was immortalized in Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, where the character Billy Bones recalls, "There was some that was feared of Pew, and some that was feared of Flint, but Flint his own self was feared of me. Feared he was, and proud. They was the roughest crew afloat, was Flint's. The devil himself would have been feared to go to sea with them. Well, now I tell you, I'm not a boasting man, and you see yourself how easy I am to live with. But when I was quartermaster, lambs wasn't the word for Flint's old buccaneers. Perhaps the most famous instance of marooning in pirate lore is that of Alexander Selkirk, whose story inspired Daniel Defoe's novel Robinson Crusoe. In 1704, Selkirk, a Scottish privateer, was marooned on the uninhabited island of Massa Tierra, now called Robinson Crusoe Island, off the coast of Chile. Unlike most marooned individuals, Selkirk survived for 4 years and 4 months before being rescued. His tale of survival captured the public imagination and contributed to the romanticized view of marooning in popular culture. Selkirk's ordeal began when he questioned the seaworthiness of his ship, the Cinque Ports, leading to a heated argument with the captain, Thomas Stradling. In a fit of anger, Selkirk demanded to be put ashore, a decision he would soon regret as he watched the ship sail away, leaving him with only a musket, a hatchet, a knife, a cooking pot, a Bible, and some clothing. However, the reality was far grimmer. Most marooned pirates faced a bleak and short existence. The legendary pirate Edward Lowe, known for his sadistic tendencies, was particularly fond of marooning. In 1722, he marooned the entire crew of a Portuguese ship on a barren rock off the coast of Brazil, leaving them with only a few bottles of water. It's believed that none survived. Lowe's cruelty was notorious, with one contemporary account stating, "Lowe was of all pirates the most savage and desperate, defying God and man, and delighting in torture and bloodshed." His penchant for marooning was just one facet of his brutal reign of terror on the high seas. Islands in the Caribbean, such as Dead Man's Chest in the British Virgin Islands, gained notoriety as marooning sites. The island's name itself is said to have originated from the practice of marooning, with pirates leaving their victims with a bottle of rum, or spirits, on their chest. Another infamous location was the Dry Tortugas, a group of small islands off the coast of Florida. These desolate, waterless keys were a favorite spot for marooning among pirates operating in the Gulf of Mexico. The playwright John Masefield captured the dread of such places in his poem Spanish Waters, writing, "Then there's the Dry Tortugas, where the man is left to rot, and his mates at sea forget him, and the world remembers not." Even the famous Blackbeard Edward Teach was not above using this punishment. In 1718, he marooned several of his own crew on a small sandy island in the Caribbean when they questioned his authority. Only a handful were said to have survived, rescued by passing ships days later. Blackbeard's quartermaster, William Howard, later recounted the incident, saying, "Teach was a devil incarnate when crossed, and those poor souls on that spit of sand learned that lesson well." The psychological impact of marooning was often as devastating as the physical toll. Captain Charles Johnson, in his 1724 book, A General History of the Pirates, described the mental anguish of the marooned, the dread of wanting provisions on a barren island where there was little or no hopes of subsistence and no prospect of ever getting off must be a terrible reflection to a man. This sentiment was echoed by many survivors of marooning, including Philip Ashton, who was marooned by pirates in 1723 on Roatan Island off the coast of Honduras. Ashton, who survived for 16 months before being rescued, later wrote, "Every day seemed an eternity, and I often wished for death to release me from my misery." Not all marooning ended in tragedy, however. In 1722, the Dutch pirate Jan de Groot was marooned on an island off Madagascar by his own crew. Remarkably, he not only survived but thrived, establishing himself as a local king among the native population. When a Dutch ship arrived years later, de Groot refused to leave his island kingdom. His story became something of a legend among pirates, with some seeing it as proof that fortune could smile even on the marooned. Another surprising tale of survival is that of Charles Barnard, a sealer who was marooned on the Falkland Islands in 1813. Barnard not only survived, but rescued another group of castaways during his 2-year ordeal, demonstrating the resilience of the human spirit in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. As the golden age of piracy waned in the early 18th century, so too did the practice of marooning. Naval forces began to favor more formal methods of punishment, such as imprisonment or execution. However, the specter of marooning continued to haunt sailors' imaginations long after its practical use had faded. The British Royal Navy officially outlawed marooning as a punishment in 1720, though isolated incidents continued to occur. Admiral John Benbow, writing in his memoirs in 1702, reflected on the changing times. The practice of marooning, once so common among the buccaneers, is now seen as barbaric by civilized nations, yet its shadow still looms large in the minds of sailors. The last recorded instance of pirate marooning occurred in 1822, when the Spanish pirate Benito de Soto abandoned several crew members on a remote Atlantic island after they objected to his brutal treatment of captives. This event marked the end of an era, but the legend of marooning lived on. De Soto's actions were widely condemned even by other pirates, signaling a shift in the moral landscape of maritime outlaws. One of his victims, who was later rescued, reportedly said, "Even among thieves, there was once honor, but men like De Soto have cast aside all pretense of humanity." Marooning was more than just a punishment. It was a manifestation of the harsh, unforgiving nature of life at sea during the age of sail. It serves as a testament to the depths of human cruelty and the extraordinary will to survive against all odds. The historian Marcus Rediker, in his book Villains of All Nations, observed, "Marooning was a microcosm of pirate society itself, a world where life was cheap, death was always near, and only the strongest or luckiest survived." The last step, plunging into the pirate's abyss. The creaking of weathered wood beneath trembling feet, the salty sea breeze carrying whispers of impending doom, and the ominous splash awaiting below. These are the elements that compose the terrifying tableau of walking the plank. This infamous punishment, oft depicted in swashbuckling tales and Hollywood blockbusters, carries with it a weight of reality that's as chilling as the waters that claimed its victims. As the notorious pirate Blackbeard, Edward Teach, once reportedly growled, "Damnation seize my soul if I give you quarters or take any from you." While not as commonplace as popular culture might suggest, the practice of forcing captives or mutinous crew members to walk off a plank into the unforgiving sea was indeed employed by some of history's most notorious pirates. The origins of this cruel spectacle are shrouded in the mists of maritime lore, but accounts of its use stretch back to the golden age of piracy in the 17th and 18th centuries. Interestingly, the term "walking the plank" didn't appear in print until the early 19th century, with one of the earliest uses found in Francis Grose's 1796 Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, where it's described as a punishment inflicted by pirates on their prisoners. One of the earliest recorded instances of walking the plank comes from the account of Dutch sailor Jan Erasmus Reining. In 1663, Reining witnessed the pirate captain François L'Olonnais force several Spanish prisoners to walk the plank off the coast of Venezuela. L'Olonnais, known for his sadistic tendencies, reportedly laughed as he watched his victims plunge into the shark-infested waters below. This act of brutality set a precedent that would be followed by other pirates seeking to instill fear in their captives and crew alike. L'Olonnais, whose real name was Jean-David Nau, was infamous for his cruelty. In one instance, he was said to have cut out and eaten the heart of a Spanish prisoner who refused to divulge information. The infamous English pirate Bartholomew Roberts, also known as Black Bart, was said to have employed the plank as a means of punishment and entertainment. In 1720, off the coast of Newfoundland, Roberts captured the Samuel, a slave ship. According to accounts, he forced the ship's captain, William Snellgrave, to watch as members of his crew were made to walk the plank. Snellgrave later wrote of the experience, describing it as a most horrid spectacle that haunted him for years to come. Roberts, who operated from 1719 to 1722, was one of the most successful pirates of his era, capturing over 400 ships. His Articles of Agreement, a pirate code of conduct, included the provision, "Every man has a vote in affairs of moment," but also stated that desertion or theft from the common fund was punishable by marooning or death. However, it was the fearsome Edward Lowe who truly embraced the theatrical cruelty of the plank. Operating in the 1720s, Lowe developed a reputation for exceptional brutality, and walking the plank became one of his signature methods of torment. In 1722, Lowe captured the Portuguese ship Nostra Senhora de Victoria off the coast of Brazil. Enraged by the captain's attempt to hide some of his gold, Lowe forced him and several crew members to walk the plank. Reports suggest that Lowe extended the plank far out over the side of the ship, prolonging the victims' final moments as they inched towards their watery grave. Lowe's reputation for cruelty was such that one contemporary account stated, "Lowe was the most noted pirate that ever was. None of the pirates of the present age can compare with him in cruelty and barbarity." The psychological impact of the plank was often as devastating as its physical consequences. Pirates understood the power of spectacle and used the threat of the plank to break the will of their captives. Captain William Snellgrave, in his 1734 account, a new account of some parts of Guinea and the slave trade, wrote of the pirates who captured him. "They obliged me to stand on the edge of the quarter-deck, threatening to make me walk the plank and murder me if I did not declare where the money was hid." This psychological warfare was a common tactic among pirates. The famous pirate Charles Vane, who operated in the Caribbean from 1716 to 1721, was known to use the threat of the plank to extort information and valuables from his captives, often without actually carrying out the act. Not all accounts of walking the plank ended in tragedy, however. In 1769, the crew of the British merchant ship Betsy mutinied against their cruel captain and officers. Rather than killing them outright, the mutineers decided to make them walk the plank. Remarkably, the captain and two of his officers survived by clinging to floating debris and were eventually rescued by a passing ship. This incident, while rare, highlights the slim chance of survival that some victims clung to as they took their final steps. The practice of walking the plank wasn't limited to the Caribbean and Atlantic. In the South China Sea, the notorious pirate Cheng Tisao, also known as Qing Shi, was said to have employed this punishment against rival pirates and uncooperative captives. Operating in the early 19th century, Qing Shi commanded a fleet of over 300 ships and 20,000 to 40,000 pirates. Her use of the plank added to her fearsome reputation and helped maintain discipline within her vast maritime empire. Qing Shi's strict code of conduct included punishments for assault on women and theft, but also allowed for the use of extreme measures against enemies. She once famously declared, "Under the leadership of a man, you have all chosen to flee. We shall see how you prove yourselves under the hand of a woman." Despite its place in pirate law, walking the plank was not as common as other forms of punishment or execution. Keelhauling, marooning, and simple shooting or stabbing were often more expedient methods for pirates to dispose of unwanted individuals. The plank was reserved for special occasions when a pirate captain wanted to make a statement or indulge in a particularly cruel form of entertainment. The infamous pirate Calico Jack Rackham, who operated in the Caribbean from 1718 to 1720, was known to prefer quick executions over the drawn-out spectacle of the plank. His lover and fellow pirate, Anne Bonny, reportedly chastised captured sailors by saying, "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." The last documented instance of walking the plank occurred in 1822, when the Spanish pirate Benito de Soto forced the passengers and crew of the Morning Star to walk the plank off the coast of Ascension Island. This event marked the end of an era, as the golden age of piracy was drawing to a close and naval powers were becoming more effective at suppressing pirate activity. De Soto's career was short-lived. He was captured in 1830 and hanged in Gibraltar. His final words were reported to be, "I die in the belief of the faith of my forefathers, a stark contrast to the merciless end he had inflicted on others. Today, the image of a trembling victim inching along a narrow plank, prodded by jeering pirates, remains a powerful symbol of the cruelty and theatricality of pirate life. It has been immortalized in literature, from J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan to Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, and continues to capture the imagination of audiences in films and television shows. In Peter Pan, Captain Hook threatens his victims with the infamous line, "Quiet, you dogs, or I'll cast anchor in you," a phrase that encapsulates the menacing yet almost cartoonish nature that the plank has taken on in popular culture. Caged in infamy, the grisly spectacle of pirate gibbeting. As the salty breeze carried the stench of decay across the harbour, crowds gathered to gawk at the macabre spectacle swaying gently in the wind. Encased in rusting iron, the remains of once feared pirates served as a stark reminder of the price of lawlessness on the high seas. This was the practice of gibbeting, or hanging in chains, a gruesome form of execution and posthumous punishment that struck terror into the hearts of would-be buccaneers and common folk alike. The renowned pirate historian Marcus Rediker once wrote, "The gibbet was the state's theatre of death, a grim stage upon which the power of authority was enacted for all to see." Gibbeting, a practice that reached its zenith in the 17th and 18th centuries, was not merely an act of execution, but a prolonged public display of the condemned. After being hanged, the body of the criminal, often a pirate, would be encased in an iron cage or framework called a gibbet. These ghastly human exhibitions were typically placed near ports, river mouths, or busy crossroads, ensuring maximum visibility and serving as a potent deterrent to those who might consider a life of maritime crime. In 1722, the infamous pirate Edward Lowe narrowly escaped this fate when he eluded capture off the coast of Boston. His lieutenant, Charles Harris, was not so fortunate. Harris was gibbeted at the entrance to Charleston Harbor, his rotting corpse greeting ships for months as they entered the busy South Carolina port. One of the most infamous cases of pirate gibbeting was that of William Kidd, whose career as a privateer turned pirate came to a brutal end in 1701. After a highly publicized trial in London, Kidd was hanged at Execution Dock in Wapping. His body was then placed in a gibbet and suspended over the Thames at Tilbury Point. For 3 years, Kidd's decomposing corpse served as a grim navigational marker for ships entering and leaving London, a fate he shared with many of his piratical brethren. The poet John Gay, in his Beggar's Opera, 1728, alluded to this spectacle with the line, "There's Kidd, in chains, the pirate hangs," cementing Kidd's gibbeted form in the public imagination for generations. The process of gibbeting was a cruel art in itself. The gibbet was often crafted to fit the specific criminal, with iron bands encircling the neck, torso, and limbs. Some gibbets were designed with a small cage for the head, ensuring that even as the flesh decayed, the skull would remain in place, grinning its eternal warning to passers-by. The blacksmith John Fern, who crafted gibbets in the 18th century, once remarked, "Each cage is a portrait in iron of the poor wretch it's meant to hold." In 1752, the body of James Field, a smuggler executed in Kent, England, was placed in a gibbet so well crafted that it held his remains intact for over 2 decades, earning it the nickname Field's Iron Petticoat among locals. The longevity of gibbeted remains varied widely, depending on weather conditions and the durability of the gibbet. In some cases, bodies might hang for years or even decades. The pirate George Wood, executed in 1765, swung in his iron cage on Beacon Hill in Halifax, Nova Scotia, for over 20 years. Local law held that on stormy nights, Wood's ghost could be heard rattling his chains, a chilling reminder of his earthly punishment. Similarly, the body of John Breads, executed for murder in 1742, hung in a gibbet in Rye, England, for an astonishing 50 years. The durability of his gibbet led to the local saying, "You'll last as long as Breads," when referring to something of enduring quality. While gibbeting was intended to deter crime, it often had the unintended effect of drawing crowds, and even inspiring sympathy for the condemned. When the notorious pirate Charles Vane was gibbeted in Port Royal, Jamaica, in 1721, witnesses reported that the crowd's initial bloodthirst gave way to a somber mood as they contemplated the pirate's gruesome fate. One observer noted, "Even the most hardened among us must pause at such a sight and consider the fragility of man's mortal coil." In 1786, the gibbeting of William Jobling, a miner executed for murder in Durham, England, drew such large crowds that local authorities feared a riot. Jobling's wife was reported to have visited the gibbet nightly, amplifying the public's unease with the practice. The practice was not limited to the Caribbean and the American colonies. In England, the Murder Act of 1751 explicitly added gibbeting as a punishment for murderers, cementing its place in the judicial system. This act led to a surge in gibbeting cases, with some estimates suggesting that over 100 criminals were gibbeted in England between 1752 and 1832. One of the most notorious cases was that of Eugene Aram, a philologist turned murderer, whose body was gibbeted in 1759 near Knaresborough, Yorkshire. Aram's case inspired Thomas Hood's famous poem, The Dream of Eugene Aram, and later a novel by Edward Bulwer Lytton, showcasing how gibbeting had seeped into popular culture. One particularly notable case was that of James Cook, not to be confused with the famous explorer, who was gibbeted in Leicester in 1832 for the murder of John Pass. Cook's gibbeting would be the last in England, as public sentiment was turning against the practice. Thousands gathered to watch his body being placed in the gibbet, with many expressing disgust at the barbarity of the spectacle. A local newspaper reported, "The assembling of such a multitude to witness so degrading a sight is little calculated to produce beneficial effects on their minds." The poet William Wordsworth, upon hearing of Cook's gibbeting, wrote in a letter, "Hanging bodies in chains on gibbets is a disgusting practice and calculated to brutalize the minds of the people." The practice of gibbeting pirates and other criminals began to decline in the early 19th century as social attitudes shifted. In 1834, England officially abolished the practice with the passing of the Hanging in Chains Act. However, the memory of gibbeted pirates lingered in popular imagination, immortalized in literature and folklore. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, 1883, vividly describes a gibbeted pirate, with the character Billy Bones recalling, "I've seen him hung in chains, birds about him flying, and sea wash at his feet." Today, the few remaining gibbets in museums serve as stark reminders of a more brutal era of justice. The gibbet of Captain Kidd, long lost to time, was reportedly recovered from the Thames in the 1920s, and now resides in a private collection. In Caister-on-Sea, England, the gibbet of highwayman William Bensley, executed in 1792, still stands as a chilling monument to this bygone practice. These relics stand as silent witnesses to a time when the line between justice and vengeance was blurred, and when the sight of a decaying pirate swinging in an iron cage was considered a necessary evil to maintain order on the high seas. As we close this chapter of history, let us remember that the gruesome spectacle of gibbeting was but one of many brutal punishments inflicted upon pirates in the Age of Sail. From Keelhauling, where unfortunate souls were dragged beneath a ship's hull, to marooning on desolate islands, the fate of captured buccaneers was often as merciless as the lives they led. As we bid farewell to these dark tales of retribution, let us ponder the words of the great Daniel Defoe, who wrote in his A General History of the Pirates, "In an honest service, there is thin commons, low wages and hard labour. In this, plenty and satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power. And who would not balance creditor on this side, when all the hazard that is run for it at worst is only a sour look or two at choking? No, a merry life and a short one shall be my motto." And so, dear viewers, as the sun sets on our journey through the annals of pirate punishment, we leave you to ponder the price of freedom on the high seas, where the promise of riches was all too often paid for in blood, pain, and infamy.